Unarmed African Americans being killed by law enforcement officers in America reached a deafening pitch this summer, with peaceful protest and civil unrest breaking out across the country. Atlanta, the city too busy to hate, became the focus of national headlines when civil unrest erupted across the city and unarmed Rayshard Brooks was shot and killed at the hands of an Atlanta police officer. Hello, my name is Imara Canady, and today we will speak to a young protester to hear what he has walked away with, what he and others are doing now to continue the fight, and what's the end game. Today we speak to Reverend Jared Sawyer Jr. Hello, Jared. How you doing?
I'm wonderful, Imara. How are you?
Good. And let me be transparent that Jared and I have known each other for a while beyond this, and I have had the joy and bounty of watching this Morehouse man grow into quite a young leader, not only in the local Atlanta community, but really nationally. And Jared, why don't we start off with give us a glimpse from your perspective of being a young leader, being a young advocate. What has really happened in our country that has taken the racial tensions that we've seen exhibit across this country to an all new high?
Well, I think that folks are just starting to get a little fed up and just not being complacent with seeing what they see. And just as I believe it was Will Smith who said that it's not that racism is getting worse, it's just that it's getting filmed. And it's becoming quite traumatic to constantly see situations where police officers are on the necks of Black men saying that they can't breathe. It's becoming traumatic to see police brutality in HD in 2020, when we thought that we perhaps maybe have been so past that 50 or 60 years ago. It's becoming traumatic to consider that there are still so many issues involving violence against Black lives, and it's just traumatizing. And I think that Black people have just grown to become fed up and tired of being sick and tired of being sick and tired, and have just decided that they can't sit back and allow things to go back to business as usual, but that they must persist and do something. Because if they don't do something, then who knows how much worse these situations can become, and how really easily history can repeat itself.
So let's talk about that, because let's actually take a couple of steps back. I know that Reverend Dr. Bernice King is one of your mentors. And I know that you have really been influenced and what some say guided by the influence of what is known as Kingian nonviolence or Nonviolence 365. So let's start with first, can you speak to what are the principles of Kingian nonviolence or Nonviolence 365 that you have learned and that you see being personified during this modern day movement?
That nonviolence seeks to defeat evil, not to defeat people. And I think that that's something that we have to consider when we're out here protesting and demonstrating and mobilizing towards justice, recognizing that, yes, there are people who are doing evil. Yes, there are police officers that are violently oppressing Black lives and attacking Black lives, but that we're not seeking to defeat people, but that we're seeking to simply defeat evil. And so that's been one of the principles of nonviolence that have resonated with me, and that I've, as a young person, have been trying to mobilize to my fellow peers.
And I want to also focus on the young people, because this particular year, Elevate is really celebrating and uplifting the community of the West End. And we know that part of the richness of the West End resides the Atlanta University Center, which is the home of your alma mater, Morehouse College, of course, Spelman College, Morris Brown, Clark Atlanta University, ITC, and the Morehouse School of Medicine. Is there some correlation between what you are seeing in this modern day movement and the movement of the 60s, the early civil rights movement?
Absolutely. I'm a history geek. I believe that we can learn so much from, what we saw to happen in the most transformative 13 years of activism in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s endeavors as the moral leader and transformative shape maker of the 21st century and the 20th century. And I think that when we look back, we do see that what's happening right now in 2020 with young people from the AUC and young people throughout the city of Atlanta deciding that they're going to stay out in the streets, that they're going to mobilize, that they're going to make their voices heard. It reminds me of the stories that I would hear of folks who have come and gone, but who we got a chance to get to know and to hear from. People like Dr. C.T. Vivian, people like Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry, people like Congressman John Lewis. I think oftentimes we forget that they were young people. They were in their early 20s out there having the same passions that we had. Their invigorative energy that they had was just surreal. And it's something that we can point towards and that we can glean off of and that we can pull from as young people that's out there getting the job done and fighting for justice.
So we know we are less than a month away from probably what will be, interesting enough, could be one of the most transformative, either way that it goes, elections of this decade and of this century. Do you think it's enough for the young people that we see, being actively in the streets to just be out there protesting? Or is this the first step to some fundamental movement of change that young people are wanting to see in this city and across this country? And what does that look like?
Yeah, it's definitely not enough to just get out in the streets and to protest. This has to be a first step, or it's where there'll be so much unfinished work that's been started, and so I've been encouraging young people to make sure that you're getting involved in the political process. And so that means make sure that you vote, because we're not just voting for the next president of the United States, but we're voting up and down the ballot. Justice is up and down the ballot on November the 3rd. We're not just voting for the president of the United States. We have 2 seats in the Senate to fill here in the state of Georgia. We've got district attorneys to seat. We've got city council members. We've got judges. We've got county commissioners. We've got school board members, and the list goes on and on. And we have to remember, as we're getting out there in the streets, the reason why we have to get involved in the political process is because very oftentimes we overlook the power of a district attorney. We overlook the power of an attorney general. We overlook the power of a city council, when it is the city council that creates the ordinances that are passed for police practices within a city, such as within the city of Atlanta. That it's a result of a district attorney's review as to how a particular person will be prosecuted and if they're prosecuted. We talk about cops being arrested and charged and convicted. That's up to the district attorney.
Right.
Getting involved in the political process, as far as we're concerned, also means making sure that as a young person, when you're 18 years old, you should look forward to serving on a jury. Let's destroy this myth that we've heard from our parents and our grandparents, or this feeling, this agitation when we get that jury duty notice in the mail and we're like, oh man, we got to serve jury duty. We should be excited because we can be the change that we want to see. What we saw with the grand jury situation with Breonna Taylor, as we've been out there, protesting and mobilizing out there in Louisville, Kentucky, and what we've seen in other cases where juries have found particular persons to be innocent where they should have been found guilty. We can be that change that we want to see. So it's not just about the president, even though we should be paying very close attention to this election and recognizing that whether or not we agree with every single statement that a particular party or that a particular candidate is saying, we got to look and see who's the best option for what we've got going on right now. But when it comes to this election, we got to recognize that there's justice up and down this ballot. And in addition to that, getting involved in the political process, people need to fill out the census today, or this at this particular moment. People are filling out the census for the next month. It was just extended for the next month for people to be able to complete their census. Encouraging young people to become a poll worker. And this is another thing that we've been really pushing is like, look, if you don't trust the system, and if you don't believe that you believe that your vote counts, but you don't believe that voting is done very much for you, look, vote in this election right here and you run for office next year.
Let me stop you there. Let me stop. You're making some very interesting points, but I want to take care of the elephant in the room. There's still so many young people that say, well, I'm not getting registered to vote. I'm not going to vote. Why should I need to vote? They don't care about me. I mean, all of these things that is also on the other side of the equation that we're hearing from young people. So as a young leader, as someone who some would say has bought into the system, how do you shift the mindset of those on the other extreme that are your colleagues?
Well, I showed them voter suppression. I showed them voter suppression. I know folks who were out there trying to vote back in 2018, I believe, during the gubernatorial election, got a chance to see it, right at the forefront. But I showed them voter suppression and say, look, this is what's happening in 2020 to suppress your vote, to suppress our vote. If our vote really did not count, they would not be sitting here and doing everything in their power to suppress the vote. Our vote counts because of that. They know what our vote can do. And so, I sympathize, or not necessarily sympathize, but I empathize rather with young people who do feel that kind of way, that their vote doesn't count, that the system is rigged, that the system was built or the system stopped working for us. And I empathize with them because they're right. We are inheriting a system 400 years of oppression. But the reason why in 1965 they marched through Selma and were beat on the Edmund Pettus Bridge was because the Civil Rights Act alone was not enough, but that Black people needed the right to vote, and they needed those protections under the law. I show young people the facts because the fact is that the Voting Rights Act was gutted in 2013. The fact is that there are secretaries of state all over this country that have come up with the most creative tactics and are depending on the ignorance of folks, of what they don't know, of what they don't look into, of them not checking their voter registration status, for them to end up getting surprised when they get to the polls. They're depending on that. And so why play into the game? This is what I tell young people. Why play into the game? Why let them trick you into this propaganda, into this narrative that your vote doesn't count simply because the system is rigged against you? Yes, it's a broken system, but it is a system that respects paper. It is a system that respects legislation. It is a system that respects voting. And this is the reason why, our ancestors who were our same age, we better believe that some of the sentiments that we felt were the same sentiments that they felt. They just knew what to do about it. And we've got to make sure that we are being clear-headed as young people, and that we're not allowing a false narrative, false information to make us really feel like our vote doesn't count, but for us to think just like our ancestors did when they were our age, and consider that the vote is the most powerful nonviolent tool that exists today, just like Congressman John Lewis said.
Okay. I want to shift the conversation some, because I think it's been important for us to have this conversation about young people and voting and starting in that space. But we are in the city of Atlanta, a community that plauds itself as, being the birthplace of the civil rights movement, and as stated in the introduction, the city too busy to hate. And what I witnessed is, over the course of these last few months, as we saw literally almost week by week, if not day by day, another young Black man being killed at the hands of law enforcement. What I also witnessed from my perspective is that aha moment when, in so many other ways, it was happening in other communities, and then it happened right here at home, which I think really shifted the brand trajectory, if you will, of Atlanta nationally, and also really begin to have so many Atlantans um, really look at this non-reality of being the city too busy to hate. So what I want to talk to you about, Jared, is really from your perspective as a young leader and a young advocate, when you have situations in our backyard, like a Rayshard Brooks, whatever your thoughts are about, one's thoughts are about what did or did not happen, what was right, what was wrong, and all that. The reality was that this was a Black man killed at the hands of a police officer on the Atlanta Police Department that did not need to happen. So when we see those kinds of situations continue to repeat themselves across the country, and now has been literally in our backyard, what do you say to your young Black brothers? What do you go back to, your Morehouse brothers now matriculating to that, the young brothers, in high school, the young brothers that, we see in the communities, whether it's the West End or in other communities around Southwest Atlanta, and lift them up and empower them to believe in the system, to believe in trusting, not only our police department, but our elected officials and our leaders.
Oh, I tell them it's rough. I tell them it's rough, and that I would be lying if I were to say that I or any other person that has come to trust the system, so to speak, is desensitized by the senseless killings of unarmed Black men. I remember, I believe it was maybe May the 29th, when we had the huge demonstration out at Centennial Olympic Park, and it lasted, all throughout the night. And I remember thinking, this was just in response to what happened to George Floyd in another state. What would happen if we were to see something like that to happen here in Atlanta, even though we've already had so many cases, as such. And when Rayshard Brooks was killed at the hands of the police, I remember actually watching the aftermath of it, literally maybe 15 to 20 minutes after it happened on Facebook Live. And I remember, people texting me and calling me and messaging me and saying, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And folks, including myself, were really just dumbfounded and shocked and just crazed, because, like, wow, this actually happened, like you said, in our backyards. Like, this has happened in Atlanta, the city that's too busy to hate. Atlanta, the city that's the birthplace of the civil rights movement and the birthplace of our moral leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Many people consider Atlanta to be a Black Mecca. And I believe that it just really shook up Black Atlanta to recognize, if they didn't recognize already, that Atlanta is a little far from being the Black Mecca that we want it to be. It's a tale of two cities, the haves and the have-nots, those who have it and those who don't. And I think what's really interesting is, being able to consider the fact that even though Atlanta is far off from being the Black Mecca, that we still have so much potential in this city, that we still have so much heart in this city. And this is what I've been communicating to young people, that yes, there is a police brutality issue right here in the city of Atlanta, plenty of unsolved cases of unarmed Black men being killed at the hands of the police, just like in other metropolitan cities around this particular country. But I actually have more faith in the city of Atlanta than I probably do in any other city in this country, because I live here. I know the people here. We have relationships with elected officials who we can hold accountable, and be it that they don't do what they are supposed to do, I have faith that our relationships with each other as a community will compel us to get out there and to vote them out and do what we need to do to make sure that Atlanta really does become the city that's too busy to hate.
So you talk about these relationships with elected officials and these relationships with civic leaders, but let's talk about accountability. Have our leaders, and I'm not just talking about our elected officials, but have our leaders across the board, have they failed the young people? Or have they been the leaders that our young people needed and still need?
You know, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's pretty disgraceful. It's pretty distasteful when we have Black leaders who went to our HBCUs, when we have Black leaders who grew up in the West End and in neighborhoods that we grew up in, and we're out there protesting, and we hear those same Black leaders, instead of them encouraging us to follow in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to follow Kenyan nonviolence and civil disobedience, to hear things like, you know, go home, you all are doing too much. We you know, we fought those issues a long time ago. Just get out there and vote. Whereas we know that voting is powerful. It's not the only solution. It's not the only tool. Sometimes you got to do, as Congressman John Lewis would say all the time, get in good trouble, necessary trouble, trouble that will involve you having to also, as he would say, get in the way. And you know, there comes this point where Black leaders in this city have to be held accountable to who they claim themselves to be and who they represent and the platforms that they choose to stand on. There comes a very fine line between being political and being right. And you know, it's very unfortunate that we do have a lot of, and I hate to say this, but sellouts in local government, even here within the city of Atlanta. But I do have faith that with the right countenance and the right pressure and the right accountability that we're putting on elected officials, whether they're finishing out a long term or whether they're just, you know, starting off in this term, that they will do what they said that they're going to do, that they're going to represent the people, that they're going to do what it takes to ensure proper representation within this city, especially considering all of the Black leaders that we have in office.
Now, the focus of this year's Elevate is equity, activism, and engagement. And, you know, there's been this whole dialogue around diversity and inclusion versus equity. You know, and we've seen young people in the streets and, you know, really focused on change. But is the change about creating more diversity? Is the change about creating more opportunities for Black folks? Or do you feel that the young leaders and young activists understand this whole issue of equity?
Absolutely. And before I answer that question, I do want to make sure that you can still hear me. You can
Yes.
still hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay, but I was getting a little bit of feedback. I want to make sure that you can hear me. I think it's all of that. I think it's all of that. I think when we talk about change and we talk about equity, we have to make sure that we are recognizing that it's different from equality. That equality is just this idea that we have, I guess, access to the same thing or to the same opportunities, whereas equity is about filling the gap between or for the folks or between and for the folks who may have started a little bit closer to the edge or that started a little closer to the center of the opportunity. So, you know, when we talk about change, we really want to see a radical change. First, we want to see a radical change in conversation out of our leaders. You know, we want our leaders in the civic space, as they're already doing, in the political arena, and even in the business arena, to engage in the conversation and to engage in the conversation in a real way where they can first and foremost admit to the disparities, admit to the inequity, and recognize that there are issues within this city, you know, and a commitment to changing this policing in the city of Atlanta, and doing a real radical change, reimagining the police. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when everything happened with George Floyd, and I believe that was in Minneapolis.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when everything happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd, it, you know, and I immediately saw how responsive the city was to reimagining police. They almost deconstructed the police department and said, we're going to reimagine policing and we're going to call it something as to the nature of public safety, a public safety department. And that right there is radical. That right there is amazing. It's encouraging. It is a step.
And let me ask you
right
something, but I want to ask you something there, because I think that's another hot topic issue that has been coming out of this current movement. When we hear this term defunding the police coming out of many of the activists, and you're using this example of what we're witnessing happening in Minneapolis, is it really about defunding the police? Is it really about reimagining how we do policing in community? Or is it really about realigning the funds that are spent by local municipalities across the board in police departments versus other areas of community development, community enhancement, community support, if you will?
Yeah, you know, I don't support the statement defund the police, because I don't particularly know what that means, and I don't think that there's a universal exploration into that for us to be mobilizing such a term, because it could be taken in so many different ways, especially considering that there are police departments around the country where a large percent of those police budgets go towards salaries. Police officers already aren't getting paid much money as public service workers, same as firefighters, teachers. My mom is a teacher, etc. I empathize with public service workers, and so I've never particularly understood exactly. I understand the purpose of the statement defund the police, but I don't encourage young people to mobilize this message of defund the police. We really don't want to defund the police. We really want to decentralize the police. You know, we want to decentralize the police. We want to repurpose the positioning of the police in our communities, and to figure out how we can reallocate some of the funds that are within the police departments, and put it towards proper training, de-escalation training, and the list goes on and on and on. For example, in the case of a Rayshard Brooks situation. 911 as a dispatch should not be sending every kind of officer to every kind of scene. Certain officers should be sent to visit certain domestic violence situations, and certain officers should be sent to certain calls about intoxicated individuals. Certain officers should be sent to certain calls about XYZ here, there,
Right.
etc. And with 1,500, 1,700 officers on the force within the city of Atlanta, we should figure out how to decentralize the police and to make it that policing actually works for the first time in this city as a model for what can happen around the country. So defund the police, I don't particularly mobilize that term, even though many others, do use it. I understand it. I empathize with them, but I encourage them to more so mobilize to decentralize the police. Let's actually make policing work for the first time as a method of public safety, where it actually works.
So, Jared, as we continue along this conversation, I really want to talk more about this whole ideology of equity, activism, and engagement, and look at this current movement. And some would say that is this movement that we are seeing in 2020, which has really been a year probably like many of us did not even imagine, is this movement really going to institute change? Recognizing that some would have compared it to the civil rights movement of the 60s, that we saw the emergence of leaders, whether it was a Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whether it was a Ambassador Andrew Young, a Reverend Dr. Joseph Lowry, a Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian, Ralph Abernathy, James Orange, or what have you. But there was a cohesiveness in the leadership where, from one lens, one could say that it's been powerful to see young people on the streets, but it's been fragmented in terms of the leadership. What is your thoughts about that and the impact that this movement is going to have based on there not really being a fundamental leader or body of leaders?
Well, yeah, there's definitely going to be change out of this movement in 2020, but it's going to take some time. Part of the reason why I think that it's going to take some time, it's because it's going to take a little bit of trial and error and some experience for young leaders out in the streets in cities around this country to connect with their elders, to go back to their roots, to study their history, to figure out what worked in the past, what didn't work in the past, and to insert those tidbits of information into their heart, minds, and souls so that it can mature them into the most magnificent version of activists that there is. The late Mrs. Coretta Scott King had a phenomenal quote that she would say that struggle is a never-ending process, that freedom is never really won, but that you have to earn it and that you have to win it in every generation. I think that one thing that, this generation is going to have to accept is that, we're not going to solve every issue of injustice. We're not going to, we're going to combat these problems, but that we're not going to solve every problem. But that there is a problem that we're going to be able to solve. There is an injustice that we're going to be able to fight and to win. But that we have to learn from our past, that we have to recognize the importance of connecting one to the other. And indeed, as you said, establishing organization, leadership within this movement. Every movement needs a leader. It just doesn't work otherwise. Don't get me wrong, we all have our place in the movement, but every movement needs a leader. Every movement needs a spokesperson, one who's able to transcend politics, government, civic community, business, You know, and I do believe that in due time, in due season, as you know, this movement continues to grow and to mature, I think we have to recognize that there are a lot of young people that are out in the streets, that this has been their first sweltering summer of discontent, as Dr. King would say. You know, and you know, for many of them, I have noticed in the streets, I have begun to realize the importance of coming together, these different factions and these different organizations and fellowships and so on and so forth. I myself have noticed a sense of unity over the course of even the past 2 or 3 months. And I believe actually that in the most recent passing of Congressman John Lewis and Dr. C.T. Vivian, I believe that it has brought a lot of young people to heal, where they began to study who they were. I just did a movie screening out on the park here in Atlanta a couple of days ago, where we actually showed the movie Good Trouble. And when young people actually saw how he was beat on the head and you know, all that he went through over the course of the past, you know, 40, 50 years, young people were so shocked. They were just like, wow, these older people that have been trying to connect with us and encourage us and influence us, they actually were us.
So they got
and
the
the anger that they had is the anger that we have. And
right.
you know, we don't know what it's like to walk down the bridge and to get beat, you know, with those clubs. You know, we don't know what it's like to do any of or to experience any of those things. And the other thing that I encourage, you know, my fellow peers to recognize, because you'll hear all the time, you know, this is not our granddaddy's movement, and this is not, and you're absolutely right, you know, it's not their movement, sure, but we can learn from them, because, you know, one thing, regardless of if you believe that we've come so far or whatever the particular means may be, one thing that is just not even a matter of argument is that we are better off now than we were back in the 1950s and 60s. They were able to successfully, in 13 years, in 15 years, eradicate segregation. You know, I mean, that's something that I don't think my peers, because I know I can't even imagine ever in my life having to, you know, be told that I can't sit somewhere in a restaurant or that I can't do something. I just can't even imagine that. So, you know, yes, it's not their movement, but we can learn, and we can connect.
So we saw that the beginning of the protesting happening in, you know, the early part of the summer, and now here we are in fall. One, are we seeing the same level? I mean, and clearly the issues are still arising. But clearly the issues are still arising in communities across our country, and still very much so right here and across our state. What have you all, as young activists, walked away with from this first iteration of, you know, the silent protests that have happened, and what work is being done now? And quite honestly, what's the end game? Where are we headed? What denotes success, or what denotes continuance of change in the right direction?
Well, it's unfortunate that we haven't seen a continuation of protests in the way that we did back in June and back in May. But it only reveals to us what I feel as though we already knew or should have known, which is that some folks, not everybody, is about that life. Some folks are ready to get out there in the streets when it's popular. Protesting is popular, and it helps folks to desensitize their emotions when they're fed up from watching these traumatizing videos of someone that could be their brother, their sister, their dad, their whatever the particular means may be, getting killed at the hands of the police. But not everyone is willing to put in the work and to continue to be out there in the streets. And I think that, if we sit back, we realize, we say, oh, we already knew that. And that's the reason why, voting is the most powerful nonviolent tool, because it's something that everybody can do. Not everybody's going to get out there in the streets, but everyone can vote. Not everyone's going to be willing to do sit-ins and these demonstrations of civil disobedience with the purpose of getting arrested, to apply that pressure and to show the sacrifices willing to be made. But everyone can vote. Everyone can fill out their census. Everyone can do their respective part to participate in the political process. You ask, what's the end goal? What is it ultimately that we want out of this generation's movement? I don't think that we know, because quite frankly, for a Black people that's never seen justice ever, don't get me wrong, we're at the point of equality, but we've never seen justice. So we have an imaginary idea of what equity looks like, but it just hasn't been made very clear to us. And so for Black people that's never seen justice, all we know to do is to march towards justice. And all we know to do is to push towards justice and to move towards justice and talk towards it. And all we know how to do is to attack issues one step at a time.
So let's pause on. So tell me what your feeling is. I mean, do you really feel like we have experienced equality?
I feel as though, in one sense, we have experienced equality. In one sense, I believe that we have, that we're far from equity, but that we have seen equality. But we just haven't seen it to be equitably distributed. Okay. Yeah. Perhaps that's the better way of saying it, that we just haven't seen it equitably distributed. We haven't seen it equitably distributed in housing. We haven't seen it equitably distributed in education. We haven't seen it equitably distributed, of course, throughout the criminal justice system. However, I believe that equality is something that we can imagine because we've seen it. I believe my generation specifically has been able to see equality. But then, even in that, though, I have to be sensitive to the reality, that I am a man, and that Black women are still, as Malcolm X said, the most disrespected women in America, as we saw with the Breonna Taylor case, right? And Sandra Bland and Tatiana Jefferson and other Black women who, we don't talk about anymore because their cases were not as popular or not as valued, And so I have to also admit that I'm saying that out of a place of privilege, as a Black man, because Black women still have not seen equality. They can only imagine equality. So for them, it's the fight for realistic equality and for equity.
Right. So, when we were seeing these early protests happening early in the summer, and even to some degree most recently, there was this constant call for, a meeting with the mayor, a meeting with the governor, a meeting with the county commissioners and whatnot. And something I find very interesting, which I think is kind of telling, is you say that you don't know that the young people really know what they want in regards to change. So one question I have is, has there been this meeting with city or county or statewide leadership?
Well, I know I've met with I've met with the mayor, and I've met and talked with several of the city council members. I know that there are a few others that have as well. I've talked with certain county commissioners. I haven't really spoken with many school board members, and I've spoken with a lot of the people who were running for the seat to fill the remaining term of Congressman John Lewis. I know over the course of the past 2 months, there are others who have been able to meet with elected officials within the city of Atlanta.
So what's been, if we don't know, if there's a feeling that the young people don't know what they want, why meet? Why protest? Why have we exhibited and seen what we've seen over these last few months, and then, get these opportunities to connect in a fundamental way with our leadership? What's the purpose of it all if we're not clear of what the end game is?
Well, I think that for most people, they feel as though there's a disconnect between elected officials and protesters. That only folks who are in the mix of civic and business world get a chance to get their voices heard. Sure, there may not be a specific end game, but there are specific issues that we want to see tackled. But even before they're tackled, we want to see them addressed. And so the protest.
What are those issues? Let's talk about that then. What are those issues?
Absolutely. Well, first is criminal justice reform. The fact that policing in Atlanta does not work, just like plentiful other metropolitan cities around this country. That there are cases in Georgia, like the Jamarian Robinson case, the Kendrick Johnson case, and the list goes on and on, where these police officers are still on the force, still working day by day. Whereas the mothers and the fathers and the sisters and brothers of these unarmed Black men who were killed don't get the luxury of going about their day with business as usual. And this city will not address these issues. They won't publicly condemn the situation itself and make a commitment to, number one, investigating these issues, and eventually arresting, charging, and convicting the cops who are doing it. And lastly, a commitment to actually reimagining what policing looks like, so that situations like what has happened to Katherine Johnson and Kendrick Johnson and Jamarian Robinson, and the list goes on and on and on, won't happen, and so there's criminal justice. There are other issues such as housing, gentrification happening in this city. Older people in their 70s, in their 80s, getting kicked out of their homes because the property taxes have been risen so high that it's unaffordable now for them to live, though they paid off their mortgage 30 years ago or 40 years ago from them working their job, and now they're depending on Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and a little bit of retirement money, and now they find themselves having to move out of their comfortable neighborhood they've been living in for the past 50 or 60 years. We've got issues like that. There's so many issues from criminal justice reform, housing, that are prime issues that have not been addressed publicly. And so, protesters out in the streets are saying, okay, look, if you can't stand with us as Black leaders to say Black lives do matter, they matter enough for me as an elected official to first address the need for reimagining police, and then secondly, actually taking the steps towards fixing the issues of injustice, and then that commitment towards reimagining the police, then we're going to keep on demonstrating and protesting and mobilizing until our voices are heard, or at least we feel that our voices are heard. We recognize that there are more issues than just criminal justice reform and just housing. You know, we even recognize that there's a dichotomy within the police department that would take more than just a mayor or a city council. But let's have an open conversation. Let's communicate about these issues and help us to understand who do we need to put pressure on? What do we need to do? What does this process look like for reimagining policing and so forth in this city?
And Jared, you mentioned you made a statement that I think is important for those joining us in this session today. There's been some resistance on some leaders to engage with this movement because of some issues, both early issues years ago to even most current issues that we've seen around the Black Lives Matter organization. So can you speak to a bit of the differentiation between the quote unquote Black Lives Matter organization and what many are calling this now the Black Lives Matter movement?
That's a really good question. I'm so glad you asked because I am not a part of Black Lives Matter, the organization. I don't know the leaders of Black Lives Matter, the organization, and I don't believe that the millions of folks out there that are actually saying Black Lives Matter have ever done such a thing as well. There is a difference between Black Lives Matter, the movement, and Black Lives Matter, the organization. Black Lives Matter, the movement, is an affirmation of Black lives in the midst of a constant oppression of Black lives. And that is what I support. And that is what the majority of protesters, demonstrators, marchers, and activists support is Black Lives Matter, the movement, as I aim each and every day to do what it takes to affirm Black lives.
And what does it look like from a young person's perspective, you know, this whole idea of allyship? From your voice and from those of your peers, I mean, we saw a number of non-Black Americans out in the streets with many young Black young men and women. But what does allyship really look like from a young person's perspective?
Oh, it's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful to see that there are white folks and Hispanic folks and Asian folks who are willing to lay their bodies down for this movement, you know, and I think it's wonderful, you know, to see such a thing, to see allies that have recognized that enough is enough and that they're just tired of leaning towards diversity without equity, and that they're deciding essentially to not be comfortable in their whiteness and to sacrifice and be willing to give as much as they possibly can towards this movement. And I think it's important, even as you mentioned, you know, about the difference between Black Lives Matter, the organization, and Black Lives Matter, you know, the movement, is that we've got to recognize that just like with any movement, and you talked about resistance from many leaders, it's oftentimes just off of false predication, off of false narrative. What they're seeing in the media is not what they're seeing in the streets. You know, I know what was happening while the demonstrations were going forth with Rayshard Brooks. People have asked, you know, how do these situations get violent? They get violent oftentimes because of provocateurs, people who are sent to stir up trouble. Not everyone that says that they are for the Black Lives Matter movement is actually for the Black Lives Matter movement. Right. Many of them are for themselves. They're provocateurs. They've been sent to stir up trouble and to cause problems and to make it seem as though all protesters are violent, are looters, damage property, start fires, etc., etc. The person who started the fire at the Wendy's during the uprising, so to speak, during the Rayshard Brooks's protest was not a part of Black Lives Matter. And so I think it's time that we correct this narrative, that we first, like you said, correct the narrative that's different between Black Lives Matter organization and Black Lives Matter, the movement. And then secondly, to correct the narrative, to check before we mobilize these videos and these conversations, because not everybody that says they're with this movement is for the movement. Some of them have been sent, and it's
Right.
it's historical. You know, we've seen it 50 years ago, 60 years ago, and so we just have to be very, very careful.
Okay, so I know we have a few more minutes, Jared. So I want to ask one more question around allyship, and then move us into a call to action. So, is it enough if I'm an ally? Is it enough for me to just show up at a protest?
It is enough for them to just show up at a protest, but not enough as in should they stop there. They should do whatever it is that they feel led to do. I don't think that we've defined what best allyship looks like. You know, I don't think anyone's come up with that answer as to saying, all right, white people, this is what you should do. If you want to help us, this is what you should do. I don't know if anyone's come up with such a solution, you know, with such an answer. I know I don't have it. I don't think I've met anyone who's provided me with such a solution. I'm open to hearing it. But them showing up does matter. Them showing up does matter. And in fact, I'd argue to say that with the protests that have happened all over this country since June or since May, when George Floyd was killed, if white people didn't show up, there would be a genocide of Black folks all over this country, because their allyship, their presence meant something. It meant that they're in solidarity, and so you know, I know it's not enough, but it is a step in the right direction.
So, in a couple of minutes, Jared, your response to this. What role does the Black church play in us moving forward? What role does the business community play in us moving forward? In 2 minutes.
You know, it is so disgraceful to see so many Black church leaders to have been silent during this movement. The role of the Black church is to do what it did back in the 1950s and 60s. Yes, you can't open up your doors right now, perhaps because of COVID-19. That's understanding. But the role of the Black church is to speak truth to power. Black church leaders, stop being silent for the fear of whatever. Your members leaving, the tithes and offerings going down, it not matching your most comfortable theology. The Black church is supposed to be a freedom church, a place of liberation, a haven where we can create the capacity for folks to heal. I believe that the role of the Black church is a role of healing. And I think it's unfortunate we don't see that very often. But it is a necessary transition that needs to be made. And I believe, did you say the business community?
Yeah, so we know that Atlanta has thrived off of having a very philanthropic and giving and engaged business community. So as we look at this movement towards Black Lives Mattering, what is the role, as in 1 minute, of the business community here in the Atlanta community?
One is to make sure that you're actually asking the activists and movement shakers where they should put their money, instead of just deciding to send it to Black Lives Matter or to commit to Black Lives Matter, but make a real connection. Figure out, where does the money really need to go? You know, put your money where your mouth is the right way, and create those job opportunities for Black people, increase the wages, commit to you know, limiting that wage gap between Black and white. You know, that's what I would say is expected as a commitment out of out of the business community.
Perfect. So we want to thank Jared for your time and sharing the perspective of a young activist leader that's been out, as they say, in these streets, making a difference with so many other young people. And to also mention that Jared mentioned the film Good Trouble, and that Good Trouble is being shown as a part of this year's Elevate Festival. So please check out the schedule and make sure you get the opportunity to see this really powerful film. And we leave you with just this. There is so much more work to be done. And the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Atlanta's own, really said it the best, I believe, when he said, "Our lives begin to end the moment that we are silent on the things that matter." Let's continue to work together and keep the struggle going. There is no place that can do it like Atlanta can do it in truly achieving equity through activism and engagement. Thank you all for joining us. Continue to stay in the struggle, support our young activist leaders, and God bless.